Hi, my name is Dr. Luke Hoeppner, and I'm a scientist at the Hoeppner Institute here in Austin, Minnesota. Thanks for joining me today. So, as a scientist, one of the things that we study in my research lab is ways to cure human disease. So, for example, one of the focuses of our lab is researching lung cancer. So, to research lung cancer and other types of human disease, we need to ask hypotheses, which are guesses or predictions, on what the outcome of an experiment is going to be. So, for example, we can test how a new treatment or cure for cancer might work, and we have to make a prediction about how it's going to work, and then we test it. So, in terms of science and as an example of an experiment, today I'm going to perform an experiment with you to teach you about science and what we do in research. So, like I said, one thing that we need to do when we make predictions in science is to form hypotheses or guesses. So one experiment that we're going to perform today is going to test how different the density of water and how different things would float or sink in this water. So density is what makes up the water and like the particles in it. So today we're going to look at fresh water and we're going to make some salt water, and then we're going to see whether these eggs float differently in salt water versus fresh water. So the first thing I'm going to do is make up some of the salt water. So these are 2 glasses of just regular water out of the tap from my sink, and then here's some salt that I got from my water softener actually. So I'm going to put some of this salt in the water, and we're going to mix it up and make salt water. So one thing you can think about is whether the density of this salt water is different than the density of the fresh water. And we're going to test how that density of salt water versus fresh water affects how eggs float or sink in the water. So I'm going to have some volunteers state their hypotheses or predictions or guesses about how the density of the salt water versus the fresh water is going to affect whether the eggs float or sink. So with that, I'll introduce my volunteers. My first volunteer is Peter. Peter, can you come?
I'm Peter, and I'm gonna help a little bit. I'm gonna
Sink.
sing.
Thank you, Peter. My next volunteer is Elizabeth, and she'll state her hypothesis about the eggs.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I think both eggs are gonna float.
Thank you, Elizabeth. My last volunteer is Hannah.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I think that the saltwater egg is going to float and the freshwater egg is going to sink.
Okay, thank you, volunteers. So now we're going to perform the experiment. So we'll mix up the salt water a little bit better and make sure that it's uniform density with the salt. And now I'll ask my volunteers to put the eggs in at the same time. And before we do that, I would like you children to think about what your hypothesis is. Do you think that the density of the salt water will impact whether the egg floats or sinks? So what do you think? Will they both float? Will they both sink? Or will one float and one sink because there's different densities of water? So could you please help?
Here,
Yeah, so come stand on this side.
I'll do this.
Okay. And go. So what's the result here? We see that in the salt water, the egg is floating, whereas in the fresh water, the egg has sunk to the bottom. So why do you think this one in the salt water is floating and the one in the fresh water has sunk? Hannah, your hypothesis was correct that the saltwater egg would float and the freshwater egg would sink. Why did you think that?
I don't know.
Because there's different density, right? So in the saltwater egg,
It has salt.
there's salt in there, and the salt has particles in the water that make the water more dense. So that's why the egg in the salt water floats, because the water is more dense and it helps hold the egg up. Whereas in the fresh water, there's less particles or less density in this water and the egg sinks. So today what we did, just to recap, is we formed hypotheses. So we made predictions on whether the eggs would sink or float, and then we tested our hypothesis to see what was correct. And that's one of the things we do in scientists. So the good news is that everyone can be scientists. You can make guesses and you can test your guesses. And hopefully today I helped show you a little bit how science works. So thanks so much for joining me and have a good day. Bye everyone.
Bye.